Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the return of Chess Books Recaptured. For anyone who has not heard, we used to do monthly book review conversations, often of classic chess books. Had to take a little hiatus while I was writing my own book, but we are back. I don't know if we will be monthly in the future, but I'm excited to get back to talking about some classic chess books. It's a fun way for me to keep up with my reading and to hear different voices and returning voices, as we will be in this pod. And I'm excited to talk about a chess classic, which is Chess for Zebras by Grandmaster Jonathan Rowson. I wanted to thank our presenting chess education sponsor, Chessable. Chess for Zebras, by the way, is available on Chessable, which I didn't even know when I decided to do this book, because this book was written in 2006. I read it a long time ago, did reread it today, but you can get it on Chessable, both in video format or in readable format. And in fact, there's even a free preview if you want to check out just a free lesson and see what the book's about. So I'll put a link to that in the show description. And my guest co-host for this is someone who was also my guest co-host when we discussed Jonathan Rowson's other classic book, The Seven Deadly Chess Sins. Regular listeners may also be familiar with his legal expertise. He is a constitutional law professor and practicing appellate lawyer, also a USCF expert and blitz specialist, rated 2400-ish on chess.com. So in addition to helping me with the Seven Deadly Chess Sins recap, he has twice been the official perpetual chess legal analyst. In regarding the Hans Niemann and chess.com/Magnus Carlsen lawsuit. So I am excited to welcome back to the podcast Professor David Franklin. Welcome, David.
Hey, it's good to be back.
Yes, we threatened to do this when we summarized the dismissal of the lawsuit, and here we are 1 month later. And as always, we got to start with the why. I know that, as we've talked about, I'm a big Jonathan Rowson fan. I know you are as well. So is that simply enough, the why, that you reached out to me to suggest that we discuss Chess for Zebras, David?
Yeah, I think when you say A, you got to say B. We recapped the Seven Deadly Chess Sins, so it's natural that we should hit the book that he wrote right after that, the Chess for Zebras.
Yeah, so he wrote these books when he was pretty young. I think he was I should have looked this up, but I think he was 20 or 21 when the Seven Deadly Chess Sins came out. And then this came out in 2006, some years later. So obviously those are formative years for lots of people. So he learned a lot. I think he has said that this is a better book. We'll maybe talk about that in due time, but I would say it's a more mature book. But how do you compare these two books, David?
I think they are similar in many ways. The Seven Deadly Chess Sins is really about the psychological and emotional side of the game. And in this book, he really turns his attention to the 64 squares. So this is much more self-consciously a chess improvement book, but it still has a lot of the deeper, sometimes rather speculative or digressive philosophical ruminations that characterize the Seven Deadly Chess Sins. So there's a lot of continuity, I think, between the two books.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if you handed people 10 chess books and didn't know who the authors were, I think you would be able to identify that it's the same author. But I have heard there's a lot of people like you and I, David, who are big fans of Seven Deadly Chess Sins. But because I recommend it a lot, I've also heard from other people who say it's not their cup of tea. They understand why people like it, but it's maybe a bit too abstract for them. And as you say, this one, I do think it's a bit more focused around adult improvement. In fact, I mean, that wasn't really a term at the time, but it was really ahead of its time in a lot of the issues it examines. So I think for that reason, people may find it more relatable, although that's, to me, primarily part one of the book, as we'll be discussing.
Yeah, I think so. Can we talk about the title for a few minutes?
Absolutely.
So Chess for Zebras, right? You look at that and you think, wait, what does that even mean? And there's a short preface to the book where Rowson tells us that he chose this title because he was thinking about white and black, right? Zebras are obviously white and black, or black and white animals. And he wanted to sort of ask some questions about the nature of black and white in chess. Does white really have the first move advantage? And if so, what's the nature of that advantage? And are there any ways in which maybe black has an advantage? And so he thought a lot about that. And apparently he did a lot of research about zebras as well, or research about zebras, I guess, as they would say in England. But then in his preface, he says, in the end, I couldn't really make that theme work. I was sort of trying too hard, he says. But he ends up keeping the title anyway, maybe
Right.
because it's an homage to Simon Webb's super fun book, Chess for Tigers. I don't know if you've read that, but it's pretty great. Or maybe just as a sort of vague reference to this general idea of thinking outside the box. You may think you have a horse in front of you, but it turns out to be a zebra or something like that. And to me, that was sort of emblematic of both the strengths and the weaknesses of the book, actually, that Rowson is asking really interesting questions, really ambitious questions. He's doing things in unconventional ways. But it's sometimes hard to follow his reasoning, and some of the ideas don't really pan out in the end. So it's a book with, I think, really strong strengths, but also some really notable weaknesses as well.
Yeah, I tend to agree. To me, it's a very worthwhile book. But as I was pulling quotes from it, I really felt, and I pulled a lot of quotes. We probably won't be able to share them all, probably like 20 or 25. And I found them often to be borderline profound insights or very succinct insights about chess. But a lot of the stuff in between, my eyes were kind of glazing over a little bit. And to Jonathan's credit, he gave an interview with Chess Base India this year, where they asked him about his books, and he was just reflecting on it. And Jonathan said, quote, "I ended up writing a couple of books when I was younger. The first was The Seven Deadly Chess Sins, and the second was Chess for Zebras. I got carried away in both of them, just following my own interests. In the case of Sins, I was just recently a grandmaster when I wrote it. With Zebras, it was more about my own journey from 2500 to 2600. It was a bit richer and a bit more serious. Both of them, in their own way, are about the human experience of playing chess and the human struggle to get better at it."
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think I mentioned when we discussed the previous book that I was actually sort of in touch with Rowson
right.
around that time in the early 2000s, and that he actually sent me a manuscript of Chess for Zebras and asked me for my comments on it. And my recollection, I think I probably got an earlier draft rather than, something that looks like the final version. But my recollection is that there was a lot of rather abstruse stuff in it about zebras and black and white. And somewhat to my shame, I decided that I didn't really have much to say about it. And I had never ended up sending Rowson any comments on it. So I guess here I am almost 20 years later, finally doing that. Some of that more abstract material survives and is in the book, but it's in part 3, which we'll come to obviously later on in our discussion. I think that's the least successful part of the book, but you may disagree.
Yeah, I actually do. For me, part 2 dragged a little bit, but we'll get to that. As you say, in time. Just to give listeners who have not read the book a bit more framework, I actually think that Gambit, the publisher, does a good job in sort of their promotional materials. So I'll read you the capsule of what they say about the book, just to give you a sort of high-level overview. So they say, "The author of the acclaimed Seven Deadly Chess Sins investigates 3 questions important to all chess players. 1, why is it so difficult to improve, especially for adult players? 2, what kinds of mental attitudes are needed to find good moves in different phases of the game? And 3, is White's alleged first move advantage a myth, and does it make a difference whether you're playing black or white?" And yeah, it's pretty well organized, I would say. Digressive in the actual prose, but by theme, I'd say it's well organized. Do you agree?
I do. I think the 3 themes are separate, so they don't necessarily cohere together in one book. The beauty of the Seven Deadly Chess Sins is that there's this unifying conception, right? Which is that there are 7, not 6, not 8, but exactly 7 sort of psychological pitfalls that all chess players could fall into. And so that gives that book just a logical spine. This one, it seemed like there were sort of 3 areas that he was interested in, and he gives each one of them a part in his book. But the overall effect, to me anyway, is a little bit less cohesive.
Yeah, I could see that for sure. And he warns before part two, he says like this is going to be the most chessy part. And it is quite different. I mean, in part two is basically like a game analysis book. Part one is more sort of rumination. And part three, I guess I would say, is somewhere in between.
I would agree with that. We should also mention, I think this is definitely a book for stronger players.
Yeah.
I would say 2000 and up. In general, the annotations and the discussions that Rowson gives are pitched to players of a pretty high level. In fact, in the very first footnote of the book, Rowson says, if you're under 1800, you should just study tactics. And he actually recommends a different book to under 1800 players, Michael Delamaza's Rapid Chess Improvement. So that seemed to me to be an implicit statement by Rowson that this book was not meant for that level of player, although I'm sure that there are some ambitious, talented, lower rated players who could get something out of this book.
Yeah. And so I agree with you. The game analysis in particular is quite high level. I mean, I'm going to be honest, when I read it, I mostly was just going from diagram to diagram. I didn't have the chess set out or even wasn't even playing through it on like an analysis on online viewer or anything like that. And it was pretty challenging, I would say. But on the other hand, I felt like the insights, I mean, of course, we'll be talking about the knowledge versus skills gap, which I think has kind of become a big part of chess improvement discourse in subsequent years. But at the time he wrote it, I think it was pretty groundbreaking, as we can discuss later. But anyway, I mean, generally to be consumed with the question of why adults struggle to improve at chess, and even he says stuff about computers that proved prescient, and his analysis about the difference in colors, like all of it I consider to be ahead of its time and also to be reasonably relatable, I would say, for players down to 14 1500. But then, as you say, the actual game analysis is just like very very high level games and analysis, almost exclusively by grandmasters, I believe.
Yeah, he has a few games from students of his who seem like they're pretty strong, maybe expert master level students. But for the most part, it's high level grandmaster games that he's looking at.
Yeah. And for listeners who are lower rated, I mean, you can make your own judgment. This book is, in addition to being still in print and on Chessable, it's really inexpensive on Kindle. I think it's $10 or something like that. So you can make your own judgment about how worthwhile it is. But to me, there's plenty worthwhile, and we'll be able to share some highlights, but I don't feel like we'll be able to cover it all, even though we'll probably go long on this podcast.
Well, should we dive in?
Yeah, I think we should. So I guess we should go to part one, which is really, I think, for regular perpetual chess listeners, this is likely to be the part they're most interested in, because he really cuts to the core of the question, why do adults struggle at improving? What stood out to you about part one, David?
A lot of things. Part one is called, I think, Improving Our Capacity to Improve. And to me, it was the closest, both in tone and in substance, to the Seven Deadly Chess Sins. In fact, I'm pretty sure that some of the material in part one was maybe originally intended for that earlier book, but didn't quite fit in, maybe because he was limited to just 7 sins. So there may be some bonus sins lurking in part one here. But as you were just hinting earlier, the overriding theme of this part of the book is the idea of skill versus knowledge. And he borrows this idea from a philosopher named Gilbert Ryle that skill is know-how, whereas knowledge is know that. So, for example, a relative beginner might, quote unquote, know that an isolated queen's pawn is a weakness. And then maybe a somewhat more advanced player might know that an isolated queen pawn actually can be a strength also, if it provides an outpost for an attacking piece or something. But a grandmaster won't just know that those things are true, but will know how to play with and against the IQP based on a whole range of pattern recognition and experience having to do with piece placement and the like, that the grandmaster might not even really be able to put into words. And I think that's a really helpful insight. It's hard to translate that into improvement. And Rowson sort of admits this. He says, when you're talking about skill, it's harder to teach. You can't just sort of memorize it the way you can memorize rote knowledge. And so in a way, I think Rowson's already anticipating books like Move First, Think Later by Willy Hendriks, when he sort of talks about the difference between knowledge and skill. But I found it very provocative.
Yeah, I did as well. Here's one illustrative quote. He says, many players, quote, work on their chess as if they're working on an academic subject, but improving your chess is much more like improving your driving or improving your play on a musical instrument than it is like preparing for an exam. Such an improvement can therefore be directed and supervised, but not directly taught. And to echo what you're saying, David, I did find this to be a profound insight. And as I sort of, I'm pretty deeply involved in sort of the chess improvement discourse, and I hear adults who've gotten into chess discuss what they call the knowledge versus skills gap quite frequently now. So I feel like here, 17 years after the book was published, I feel like people have become increasingly aware of this challenge. But again, in 2006, I know someone else who wrote about it early was National Master Dan Heisman. It's covered in his The Best of Novice Nook book, but I'm not sure. That's a compilation of columns he wrote for Chess Cafe. So I don't know when he wrote the actual column. Like, I don't know who in the chess world gets original credit. And I actually ended up writing about this topic in my book a bit and doing a bit of research. And a lot of it had overlaps of something that Dr. Christopher Chabris has talked about on the podcast. And I've read in a bit of my amateur neuroscience reading, which is the difference between fluid and crystallized intelligence. Basically, fluid being the ability to sort of calculate numbers in your head, your working memory, your ability, which actually Rowson talks about, your ability to hold multiple data points in your head at the same time. And these are things that tend to improve. People are better at improving them when they're younger versus crystallized intelligence, which is just your ability to learn facts. And I think adults often are drawn towards improving their crystallized intelligence in chess, reading more books. Rowson talks about, he quotes Grandmaster Nigel Davies talking about reading and nodding. He says, chess learning is not reading and nodding. Chess learning is doing and getting better. But anyway, David, in my research about fluid and crystallized intelligence, one of the subjects that is cited as an example of crystallized intelligence, where you can continue to get better into your 50s and 60s, one example was vocabulary, but another example is actually law. So I thought it would be interesting to hear how you compare your ability to practice law and gain knowledge about law and sort of improve your craft as you age in law compared to chess.
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I think there are a lot of similarities. Both of them are basically a set of structures that you learn pretty early on, and then you can plug different modules into those structures so that if you understand the basis or the rudiments of common law reasoning, and you may have learned that in the context of tort law, well, you can plug in your new knowledge of, say, copyright law or even constitutional law into that same framework. And I think some of the same could be said for chess. They're kind of a set of patterns that you can learn early on, and then you can add sophistication and detail, let's say, as you get older. But there does seem to be a pretty serious plateau effect in chess. This neuroplasticity thing is a real deal. I mean, we all know the experience of playing against strong young players nowadays. And it feels like, yeah, they can assimilate patterns through just playing a ton and studying a lot that I, at my age, will probably never fully understand. So maybe one can improve at law at an older age than at chess. I've never really thought about that. I think the discussion about sort of knowledge versus skill brought up a couple of other thoughts for me as well. One of them, I'm just fascinated with this question, which is when you take these neural net learning systems like AlphaZero, right? What are they actually learning? Right? Like when AlphaZero played all those billions of games against itself, does it now know, quote unquote, that a rook on the seventh is strong? Probably not, right? I think it just knows how, right? It's a know how, not a know that. It probably just knows how to do like a million incredibly subtle, discrete things on the path to maximizing its chance of winning, which will often involve putting a rook on the seventh, but obviously it cannot articulate or show algorithmically that that's what it's doing. It's just doing it.
Yeah.
And then the other thought I had, speaking of the sort of adult improver community, you're much more, I think, closely, in contact with those folks than I am. But I see these posts on Twitter with the hashtag chesspunks and so forth, where people say, I've now studied 304 out of the 400, exercises in such and such a book, which is great. Like, it's great to get affirmation and validation on your progress and so forth. But I always wonder when I see those things, like, okay, have you gotten any better at actually playing chess? You've looked at a lot of pages. What's next? Is that more like reading and nodding in the Nigel Davies sense, or is it something deeper that's going on? I'm sure it differs from player to player.
Yeah, and I certainly experienced that because what he describes, and he does have prescription for how to basically improve the know-how instead of know that. And of course, what he prescribes is what you might expect. Play a lot of competitive games, but he also gives very specific advice about setting up game-like positions and insists on even using a clock. And he wants positions that don't necessarily have a solution. So I thought of like the recent Wojciech Miranda books as being possibly decent proxies, but he has very specific advice about not just trying to acquire knowledge, but actually kind of trying to repeat the skill of trying to perform. But as someone who in theory would like to get better at chess, but my motivation waxes and wanes, I certainly understand, again, the ability to gain knowledge just seems so much easier than the ability to gain skill. So I think that's
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that suggestion about just setting up a position, he just says, like, find a position that seems interesting to you, somewhere.
Yeah, I have the quote actually.
And then just set it up and think about it for 20 minutes. Yeah. Do you want to read the quote?
Yeah, I mean, we pretty much nailed it. He says, however, the main thing is to get into the habit of sitting down, selecting a problem, setting it up, setting the clock, thinking, stopping, comparing your analysis with the source analysis, and keep doing this. It will be hard and you will not really be, quote, learning anything through this. But as I've said before, chess is about skill. What you need is not know that, but know how.
And the skill that he's talking about there is just the ability to focus and concentrate. That's what's so interesting, right? It's and he gives an example of a game that he played against Yermolinsky in the World Open shortly after having done all of that work that you're describing, which was work that he did with Artur Yusupov. And in the Yermolinsky game, he just sort of is able to sink into the position, to think deeply about the details and the complications, and concentrate. He also gives an example of an incredibly difficult same colored bishop ending that he gives one of his students on the Internet Chess Club. That then he reprints the entire text exchange that he had with this student about this. I mean, this position where there's a zugzwang, 20 moves down the line or something. I mean, I would have jumped out the window. Like this kind of sustained concentration work is just so hard to do, but so valuable.
Yeah, I mean, I just can't help but be impressed. As we'll talk about, I mean, and as we've already said, this is not a perfect book, but I just find his insights so far ahead of their time as I look back on it now.
Yeah, and there's some great ruminations in part one also about storytelling, uh, where Rowson is really attracted to this idea that human beings sort of make meaning out of what's going on around them, and they do that through narrative. And he says chess is no exception to that. We tell stories about our games. I was better, but then I blundered, or my opponent messed up, and now I will punish him. Um, and actually, I started thinking as I was reading this about your friend and frequent guest Andras Toth, who's always telling his students, no, chicos and chicas, don't give me stories, give me variations, give me moves. Terrible. Sorry, I can't do the Hungarian-Australian mix there.
Stick to Selecki.
Oh my God, I'm terrible at that too.
No, that one's pretty good.
But it's interesting because Rowson doesn't quite say, I don't want stories, I want variations. In fact, he says, becoming a better player might be a matter of learning to tell better stories. And I don't know. I think maybe he's getting carried away. He obviously, Rowson loves the idea of narrative. And maybe he thinks it's inevitable. So if you're going to be telling stories anyway, you might as well tell ones in which, as he says, your assessments and your variations make sense of one another. But my practical advice would be more like Andras's, which is try to avoid storytelling altogether and just focus on evaluating the position in front of you.
Yeah, well, to me, there's a distinction. So I again have the quote or a quote in front of me, which is he says, when we think about a position, we are in many ways narrators of our own games. And he compares it somewhere to this idea of trends that he highlighted in Seven Deadly Chess Sins, where he says, he's not sure how to quantify it, but his experience has been that there indisputably are trends within a game where you feel like one person has the momentum and then you suddenly feel like it shifts. And I'll always remember when I interviewed Ewan Hammer, he also hit on that point from that book, saying that it really rang true with his experience. And to me, when Rowson talks about telling stories, he's talking about, or the way I interpreted it was, the story you're telling yourself during a game, and sort of the need to be aware of the fact that your judgment is extremely subjective about what's going on in the game at the moment. Whereas what Toth is referring to, which is a very valid criticism in my mind, is when you're actually using stories to justify your moves. You're using stories instead of giving variations. Whereas I think Rowson, I interpreted it as you're playing the game, and this is the story you're telling yourself about how the game's progressing, and this is how it's impacting your decision making.
But maybe the best thing to do in order to really maintain sort of trend sensitivity is to not tell a story at all.
Right. Yeah.
Is just to sort of say, no human being could ever do this, right? But to strive for the position of saying, with every single move, I'm going to try to assess the position that I have in front of me as if there were no history and no future, be in the moment.
Yeah, here's a quote. He said, my impression is that many players get into trouble because they have definitive assessments and vague ideas, when what you want is clearer ideas and revisable assessments, almost the exact opposite.
Yeah, I like that quote as well.
Yeah, but of course, easier said than done. But yeah.
So you move on to part two, or do you have more thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, in closing, I would just say this is part one is worth the $10 on Kindle, or if you prefer to get the Chessable. I mean, for me, it was, I like part three. It sounds like you're not as big a fan. I like part three as well, but this was my favorite part. And it's just, you can read it in probably 90 minutes, the whole part, something like that. The book itself is fairly long, but when you're only reading a third of it, but it alone is worth the purchase of the book. But yeah, other than that, I think we can move on to part two.
Great. Well, maybe I can try to convince you that there's more good going on in part two than you think.
Okay.
It's a mixed bag for me. Part two is called A Mental Toolkit for the Exponential Jungle. And as you say, Rowson tells us that this is the most chessy part of the book. And I agree with you. This part is basically just an annotated game collection without a whole lot of unifying theme other than, hey, great players are great because they're flexible, because they're able to grind, and they're able to play ugly moves when necessary, and they're basically able to do all the things that the position calls for. I didn't like the part where he has this grand unified theory of, he says, well, Kasparov thinks that there are three dimensions to chess: material, quality, and time. But Hubner criticized this in some abstruse way. And I, Rowson, have decided, no, there are four dimensions: material, quality, opportunity, and time. This did nothing for me whatsoever. It just felt pretentious and not useful. But there are other parts of part two that I thought were as good as any part of part one. One of my favorite parts is called Doing and Being, where Rowson says, especially when you're playing a lower rated opponent, often you don't have to do very much. Let your opponent make mistakes. Let the tactics come to you. And he opens this chapter with this amazing Tony Miles game, where Miles, by his own admission, does, shall we say, bugger all. I think Miles used an even riper phrase there. Just trades a bunch of pieces and still wins because his opponent makes a couple of almost imperceptible errors. There's a funny quote from Johan Harderson where Harderson says, playing Karpov is like the following. He says, nothing happens and then you lose, right? Now, you have to be a very good player to take advantage of that kind of advice, obviously, but I think it's still helpful. Like, I know from my own experience that I'm often trying way too hard to win when I play against lower rated players because I'm afraid of drawing and losing those precious rating points. And I'm spooked by this idea of the kind of intrinsic drawishness of chess. But what Rowson is telling us here is that chess is actually much more difficult than it is drawish. Right. And so the chances are that your opponent is going to go wrong. And if you're just alert to that and opportunistic, you can beat people without feeling the pressure to constantly do things. So I thought that was very valuable.
No, I agree. I mean, it's certainly something I've experienced on both sides. I mean, when I'm playing someone who I feel like I should beat, or if my position is going badly against someone around my rating, I think I've mentioned this before, I have a tendency to sort of panic and maybe try to calculate my way out of it and burn up a bunch of time, when in reality, you just have to keep going. And as I mentioned when I interviewed Dina Belinskaya, I played her in Charlotte and had what I thought was a vicious attack. It turned out the engine says it was an equal game, but I thought I had a really nice attack. I at least thought I was doing well, but in any event, I wasn't doing badly. But she did a postmortem for her Twitch followers that I caught, and I was just really struck by how sort of patient she was. I mean, her approach all along was, I'm playing a weaker player. Sooner or later, he's going to mess up. And that's exactly what happened. But it's another case where it's easier said than done. But certainly, I did find that to be a very valuable insight. And he has another metaphor that probably also struck a chord with you. I know they mention it in the Chessable promotional materials, which is the idea of keeping it between the hedges. So similar to the concept of being, he says, another expression that captures the idea of being is keeping it between the hedges. In Northern Ireland, this expression, just keep it between the hedges, is based on advice given to motorists on some country roads not to worry too much about the exact position of the car as long as you don't bump into anything on either side. I'm not claiming this capacity to keep it between the hedges is a style to aspire to, but I do think it is something to be aware of. I've seen thousands of chess games lost through players trying too hard to do something when it would have been enough to keep things roughly on the straight and narrow.
Yeah, I like that too. And it's, of course, again, very hard advice to follow, right? I mean, I often feel like, especially when I'm playing a stronger opponent or in a sharp position, that playing is a little bit more like driving a car with a totally shot alignment, right? Where your arm muscles are like straining just to keep the steering wheel from lurching in one direction or another. But, if you can manage it, that's sometimes all you need to do.
Yeah. And he cites Mickey Adams as someone who does a good job keeping it between the hedges, which obviously a legendary player, but yeah, he does have that reputation of just being very, very solid and very resilient and tough to bring down.
No, absolutely. I think the hero of this part of the book, though, is Luke McShane. So
Yeah.
there's another part of this chapter that I really liked called Glorious Grinding, where Rowson gives all these great examples of grinding, patiently nursing a small advantage, probing, waiting, pouncing, which is similar to this idea of be rather than do, right? It'd be actually really interesting to compare this part of this book to the Chessable course on grinding by Magnus Carlsen and David Howell, which I haven't had a chance to check out yet. I guess Rowson's book was published just as Carlsen was beginning to appear as a serious competitor on the world stage.
Yeah.
But in this part of the book, for some reason, all the grinding is done by black, which I thought was really interesting. Maybe this was a bit of a vestige of this black and white zebra theme where Rowson is trying to think of ways in which black can fight back or gain a psychological advantage, neutralize white's first move edge. But anyway, these games, several of which are by Luke McShane, I just found fascinating, right? And the main lesson that he wants us to take away is don't worry about the result.
Yeah.
Just enjoy the process of looking for opportunities, looking for small advantages, just playing chess, right? At one point, Rowson says, Luke was enjoying playing so much that he almost forgot he was playing for a win. And that's really interesting, right? Because I think we associate grinding with players like Fischer and Carlsen who have this intense will to win at all costs. But what Rowson is saying here is look at Luke McShane, who seems to just enjoy playing, right? And David Howell may be similar, right? He seems to just love the game.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why both of them love to play these triple-digit games, right, over 100 moves, and just let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah. One other thing on Magnus, shout out to the person who brought this to my attention. I was doing like a Chessable webinar, but Magnus did read Chess for Zebras and actually recommended it on his Twitch stream. He was asked for book recommendations, and he recommended a Rook Endgame book by Karsten Mueller, although not the one that he famously read as a kid, a different one. But then he talked about Chess for Zebras and said he hasn't read Seven Deadly Chess Sins, or this is as of a year or 2 years ago or whatever, but he had read Chess for Zebras. But actually the part that he proceeded to talk about is part 3. He found he then proceeded to mention the discussion of like colors, which we'll get to, but I mean, so it may have influenced his play because he did read it at some point. And yeah, McShane, he does definitely come across as like a major hero of this book.
For sure. Well, do you want to turn to part 3?
Yeah, I think we've covered, and yeah, you do make a good point about part 2. It was and there is one other nugget I want to share from it. But first, I'll just complete the thought that you do make a good point that some of the insights are quite striking. It's just I had the same reaction to you about the philosophical structure and the Kasparov quote and the chess is 1/4 this, 1/4 that, which you did a good job summarizing. That just lost me a bit more than anything in part 1. And the other sort of metaphor that I liked was this idea of being Protean, which I might be mispronouncing, but he said, in this respect, I would like to introduce Proteus or Proteus. Do you know, David?
I would say Proteus, but I think it's
Okay.
Tomato,
Proteus.
tomato.
A Greek sea god who would change his shape at will and was almost impossible to catch. Proteus may be a mythological character, but the word Protean is derived from his name, and to be I'm sure there's people like yelling at their audio about how I'm pronouncing this. And to be Protean is to be versatile, mutable, and capable of assuming many forms. Good chess players have that, and that they can move from one psychological shape to another. And then he does go on to cite Luke McShane. Protean. Yeah.
And again,
I just listened to it.
Again, easier said than done.
Yeah,
but if we could all be shapeshifters, I'm sure we would do that.
Yeah. Well, should we be Protean and move on to part 3?
Yeah, I think this is good because now we're really going to disagree.
Okay, let's do it.
So part 3, the final part of the book, is called Thinking Colorfully About Black and White. And as I indicated earlier, this is almost certainly the sort of germ from which the title of the book and maybe the whole idea for the book grew. And frankly, this is where the book goes off the rails for me. Rowson starts by taking many, many pages to say that while white may score 55 or 56% from the starting position, that's just a statistic. Every game is different. If you're black, you can still fight. That's all he needed to say. But he belabors it with these terms like hypertheory and ceteris paribus, which is Latin for all things being equal, and plus equus, which
I wasn't into that part.
Does that mean like, add a horse or something? I didn't even know what that means. And it's just all completely unnecessary in my view. Of course, if you thought that it was hopeless to be black, you wouldn't play chess, because half your games you're going to be black. And of course, every game is unique. What's so interesting to me is the background assumption against which this whole part of the book is written, which is that white starts with a significant initiative, even at the highest levels of grandmaster play. Look, that was the conventional wisdom 20 years ago when this book was written, but it's definitively not the conventional wisdom anymore. And I actually think Kasparov could already see that in 2005. He famously beat his head against the Berlin Wall without success in that 2000 match against Kramnik. And then right when this book was published, actually 2005, Kasparov retired, in part to pursue politics in Russia, but also I think in part because he could see that his mammoth advantage in opening prep, particularly with white, was becoming obsolete. And then fast forward 20 years to today, and you have Carlsen abdicating his title for pretty much the same reason, because he realizes that at the top level, you can't get anywhere with white in classical chess. So insofar as Rowson is speaking to his top-level GM counterparts, everything that he says in part 3 is, in my view, obsolete. It has not aged well. Let's put it that way. Well, I mean, look at the openings that he's talking about in part 3, or just go to the opening index for this book. There's so many Najdorfs, Trompowskis, Benonis, Frenches, where white is just better. There's not a single Berlin or Petrov or Catalan or, say, Queen's Gambit accepted. But those are today's battlegrounds, right? Those are the areas where black is completely bulletproof, right, at the highest level. Now, of course, the story is going to be different at the club level. But I also just don't think Rowson's very abstract discussion here has much to offer club players. So I just found this section on the openings to be, at the very least, obsolete and just not useful.
Okay. I mean, I could concede that it's dated, but I was putting myself more in the shoes of when he was writing at the time. And I mean, he was pushing back against something, he wasn't like making it up. So, he cites a Dorian who had written, I'm probably mispronouncing his name too, who had written Black is Okay, and talks about, cites some examples from his books about how black was doing better than people had previously said. But he also, like, when he looks at engines, I feel like he was ahead of his time. He writes, certainly if analytical engines continue to improve at their current exponential rate, it won't be long before we can have clear and definitive assessments of most end games, many middle games, and somewhat later, many openings too. However, if chess ever does begin to be solved in this way, it seems it will be extremely unlikely that it will be recognizable as the game that we currently play. So we're maybe not at the point he describes in the last sentence yet, but certainly he saw coming everything that happened in terms of like how engines have, as you say, solved so many openings. So as you mention it, I do concede that this section could have been tighter, but I hadn't even wrestled with the philosophical question that much of like why white, because white does score better than white should, given what we know that chess is a draw. So to me, there is something there. There is something worth exploring. And I looked at the Lee Chess Explorer and like sorted through rating ranges, and across the rating spectrum, white still does better, and it's kind of weird. Like, why is that, especially at the lower levels?
Well, that is the one part of this section that I thought, well, there are actually two parts of this section that I thought were interesting. One is where he tries to account for that. And he says, well, by virtue of having the first move, white has sort of more margin to absorb kind of counter blows from
Right.
black. Whereas if white hits black, someplace sensitive, someplace tender, black has got one ply less margin for absorbing that. And that would seem to account for the difference. Where I really lose him, though, is where he sort of tries to both push back against Adrian, but also kind of jump on the black is okay bus. So there's a point where Rowson, I think building actually on Mihai Suba, argues that black may have a sort of advantage in that black has more information, right? One ply, more information about which moves have already been played, which I think Rowson recognizes is a preposterous argument, even as he's making it, because, of course, by the virtue of the same fact, white has also gotten one more punch in on black, and the punch seems to be more important than the information, which Rowson, recognizes. But then he says, well, okay, white may have an initiative, but black, again, borrowing from Mihai Suba, has more quote-unquote potential, which is a term that Rowson never defines, and which I did not know what he was talking about, basically. Here's a quote. Rowson says, one of black's aims in the opening should be to maximize potential so that he can make information more important than the initiative. Now, I read that sentence several times. I still have no idea what it means. It's one of those moments where Rowson sort of admits that he says, I know I'm speaking very abstractly. I don't, that sentence is not even legible to me.
Yeah, well, like he shows like the hippopotamus around there, these sort of openings where black sort of concedes some space. And I guess the idea is that you hope that the other side will, in a hypermodern sense, the other side will overextend themselves.
Yeah.
But
yeah. The other point in this part where I do think Rowson has a point is where he says black may have a psychological advantage, at least at lower levels, in that white will feel some responsibility to win. And so if black manages to equalize, then white might find it psychologically hard to adjust, and the initiative may shift. And this really connects back to that great chapter on grinding, where, as we said, all of those grinds by Luke McShane and others were done by black, right?
Yeah.
So I sort of liked that connection, but I honestly could have cut all of part 3 and been very happy.
Oh, okay. I definitely wouldn't cut it. I could see reducing it significantly. You've made some good points, but I did find some interesting points. I mean, it had me looking at how different openings score. I mean, probably I should be doing this anyway, but just out of curiosity, not like going deep into the variations, but like 1E4, how do the different moves do? And then like sorting by every 200-point rating band, because he had the sort of philosophical discussion about the mainline Sicilian trading the center pawn for the wing pawn. And it's funny, the double king pawn at the grandmaster level, it wins less, but draws more, unsurprisingly. And overall, black's expected value is going to be highest with double king pawn in grandmaster games, but Sicilians do still win more. But once you get to the club level, E5 is the worst opening.
That's so interesting. Wow.
Yeah. And even though it's objectively the best, and I started to think about why that might be, in my own opinion, might be that. And I remember there was some recent discourse, I think it was on Twitter, where someone was just talking about what opening should I play against double king pawn, and they were saying if you're playing double king pawn, you're always going to run into someone's specialty, some like obscure gambit, whether it be the Evans or the Danish or whatever it is. Like, it's just there's so many little pitfalls. So maybe that's what's taking place at the club level, or as you were alluding to, like maybe, and I think Kotrianis talked about this. He quoted Kotrianis in the book that people have their pet openings as white, so they do more work in them, and maybe they win. Although that's sort of oppositional to the point that he makes, that many others have made, that the openings are not actually determining the outcome of the game. One
Well,
other
that's why
thing,
I thought this final section was geared towards higher rated players.
right? Yeah,
You can tell that Rowson loves the Sicilian, right?
yeah,
So do I. You and I probably both love the Sicilian. But when Rowson says that it's the best black defense against 1E4, that's just so 2005. I mean, the
right.
only top player in the world who still thinks that in 2023 is MVL, and even he doesn't think that.
Yeah.
So it just, this part of the book to me was overtaken by time.
Yeah. Okay. That's valid. One other point, though, that did resonate with me was again from the Cotrianis thing, where he talked about a placebo effect, where he said maybe the reason that people score better with white is because they think they're supposed to do better with white. So they just have more confidence. So from a psychological perspective, I did find the general discussion interesting, but I definitely get your point. It's definitely more outdated than the other sections and could have been shorter.
But I like section 2 better than you did. So
Yeah, although
overall,
you
I think
did like some of
our
the stuff I
assessment
had
of the book
forgotten
is very
about.
positive.
Yeah, some of the stuff I to me, part 1 had the highest batting average, but the peaks were just as good in part 2 as in part 1. But anyway, I mean, probably not that interesting for people who haven't read the book to hear. So, but overall, I would say worthwhile book. Are there any other quotes that haven't come up that you feel that people definitely should hear, David?
Oh, me, I have a bunch, but I'll just do a few. At one point, he says in the midst of one of his game annotations, as a rule of thumb, I think it is wise to be extra suspicious of any plan that takes more than 3 moves to implement. And I thought that was just great.
Yeah.
Like I could see myself quoting that to my students when they say, okay, well, I'm going to go here, 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 here. And you say, no, slow down, right? Don't overplan.
Yeah.
So that I thought was excellent. He also at one point quotes Lev Sakis as saying, one idea is not enough. Good moves usually have at least 2 ideas, which I thought was also really interesting.
Yeah. I liked the
So
little
those
Paco.
are 2 quotes that I really like.
Okay, I've got one for you. I liked the Paco Vallejo, who's now Spanish number 1, 2700 level grandmaster. But he said that he was looking at a game with I am Geert van der Strict and Paco, and the Geert was uncomfortable about weakening his pawn structure and kept repeating, but my pawn structure, I couldn't do that to my pawn structure. And he said, Paco listened to this plea a few times in silence, but eventually remarked, you shouldn't worry so much about your pawns. They'll be perfectly straight again in the next game.
Yeah, I like that one too.
Yeah.
Um, any other quotes for you?
I mean, similar to you, I could go on and on, but I mean, I guess the one other one I would give is about yin and yang. I'm guessing, did this one resonate with you, or was this one a little too far gone for you, David?
No, I think I'm going to like it. Remind me.
Okay. He said, Taoists conceive of the world as an ongoing interplay of 2 expressions of the same cosmic energy, qi. Yin refers to the receptive, the yielding, the adaptive expression of this energy, while yang refers to the active, creative, and productive aspects. It's important to grasp that they are not in opposition. When a Western mind comes across 2 things, our first instinct is to think of a duality, i.e., to think that the 2 things are completely different and separate from each other. Yin and yang are not like that at all. The yin-yang polarity is called a polarity because at a conceptual level, the poles are at the endpoints of the same stuff. All that takes place between the poles is yin and yang. Neither that is closer to yang or yin, but never exclusively one or the other. The relevance to chess is that I think most players place far too much emphasis on the yang aspects of playing, doing things, being creative, making things happen, rather than the yin aspects, being adaptive, letting things happen, absorbing pressure, taking it easy.
Yeah, I like that. That's obviously from the being versus doing chapter, which I kept being reminded of that famous graffiti that I think Kurt Vonnegut quotes in one of his novels, where you have famous philosopher Lao Tzu who says to be is to do, and then Aristotle says to do is to be, and then Frank Sinatra says do be do be do.
Right.
But there's one more quote that I thought really captures what makes this book and what makes Jonathan Rowson unique. He says, the enduring fascination of chess lies in the complexities of the game matching the cravings of the human intellect. There's freedom to set sail in creative expression, but ideas are always anchored by logic. It is infinitely exacting, but it stretches without strain.
Yeah, very poetic. And there's certain, having read The Moves That Matter and interviewing Jonathan about it in recent years, there's even strains that come up all the way dating back to his works, like the connection between chess and love of concentrating. He says it's not so much that we concentrate in order to play chess, but that we must play chess in order to concentrate. We love the experience of concentration, and that is what chess offers us. And I definitely think he's on to something there.
Especially in the age of smartphones, just the ability to get away from the screen and have something just singular to think about for, a long period of time is priceless.
Yeah. And for me, I'm still an avid reader, but I'm constantly checking my phone when I read. So, and blitz chess online, like I'm not checking my phone, I'm able to focus, but it doesn't feel the same because it's still digital. So to actually play over the board chess, it's like, it's not only that I'm not checking my phone, but that I'm not thinking about it. It's those moments are so rare now.
Yeah, no, I agree. So I think listeners will have a pretty good sense of our overall assessment of this book, but do you have any sort of thoughts in summary?
No, I feel like we've correctly, I shouldn't say correctly, but hopefully sort of characterized the good and the bad of the book. To my mind, again, the good far outshines the bad, but I do want anyone picking up the book based on this podcast to have a full sense of what they're getting into. And I would say, again, slightly less abstract than Seven Deadly Chess Sins, some profound insights, but there may be a moment or two where you're turning the page a little bit quicker.
Yeah, I think we're largely on the same page, though maybe which parts we like better differed. But overall, to me, this is an excellent book. It's not quite a classic on the level of Seven Deadly Chess Sins for me. And I think I touched earlier on why I think that. It just, for me, Seven Deadly Chess Sins has this sort of unifying theme. And also, I think because that book is sort of about the kind of timeless foibles of the human psyche, Rowson sort of earns the right to engage in his psychological and philosophical rambling a little bit more. Whereas this book is really about what goes on the chessboard. And so some of the philosophical musings to me felt a little bit more extraneous here, but there's tons of instructive material in this book, and that material is just terrific.
Yep. Yeah. Well said. And I also prefer Seven Deadly Chess Sins. I know Fred Wilson. I was looking for a quote and Googling and I actually came across a quote from when he was, I think, on Perpetual Chess. But anyway, he prefers Chess for Zebras. And again, for anyone who, like, Seven Deadly Chess Sins, the philosophical side resonated with you and I, but with others, if it didn't resonate, you may find this book slightly more practical. And if you're like really into adult improvement, again, I think you could just read part one, start part two, see how you like it, and then decide from there. But part one alone is worth it.
Agreed.
All right. Well, David, thanks again. I really appreciate you, as now you're the official law correspondent and the official Jonathan Rowson correspondent here on Perpetual Chess.
It's an honor. It's
excellent.
Always fun.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for coming on, and hopefully we can find a new author, or maybe Jonathan will write another book. I don't think we could do The Moves That Matter, but maybe we can chat about another book someday.
Well, I hope we find an excuse to get together. Thanks for having me on.